I received an email from Anita Reed. If you don't know Anita, I think she can best be described as the Mary Bunch of the Robertson School of Government. The dean, says the dean. She's running the show, and she said, hey, we have this unique opportunity to host Pastor Andrew Brunson. Is the law school interested? And by God's divine sovereign hand, it just so happened this exact same time when Pastor Brunson was going to be visiting the Robertson School of Government is the day of our retreat. This is a man who is an American hero, a spiritual hero, a man of God. And we are incredibly blessed to hear from him. I'm going to give a brief introduction, but really don't want to steal his thunder, his story. He serves as the special advisor for religious freedom at the Family Research Council. He and his wife, Noreen, were involved in starting churches and a house of prayer, training Christian leaders, and providing aid to refugees in Turkey for 23 years. And they still carry out ministry in the Middle East today. In October of 2016, Pastor Brunson was falsely accused on terrorism charges and was held for 2 years in Turkish prisons. Following a worldwide prayer movement and significant pressure from the United States government, as well as involvement from our very own ACLJ, Pastor Brunson was finally released in October of 2018. He holds a PhD in New Testament from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and is the author of an excellent book that I had the chance to page through last night called God's Hostage. Again, incredibly blessed to meet this man. He is faithfully walking out the call of a believer in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Pastor Andrew Brunson.
So I believe there is a dark wave of hostility and persecution that is going to hit the church in the United States. And this may sound counterintuitive right now. The majority of evangelicals voted for Trump. Probably many of you in this room did, I would guess. And many have a sense of relief and even confidence with his victory. And he is rolling some things back, and I'm very grateful for this. But the truth is that our society has changed. Being a Christian is no longer socially advantageous, especially in high status positions. Christian morality has been rejected. Every institution in the United States is led by people who are post-Christian, and increasingly they're aggressively anti-Christian. So there are going to be some good changes in the sphere of government for a time, and I'm glad for this, but my sense is that what we have now is not a long-term reversal of our culture, but a delay in the dark wave that is going to come. Because as a country, I think we're headed where we're headed. And I think that those who look at the recent political victory as a victory for Christians, I know that some people do, or a victory for the church, are probably going to be disappointed because many people on the right are not there because they have Christian values. They're going to push back against some of the excesses of the progressive left, but not because of Christian values. And this is going to help Christians, but let's not think that this is the same as a revival or the church beginning to dominate the different mountains of society. So as some things are pushed back, it creates a vacuum, and I don't think it's a church that's going to fill that vacuum. It's going to be something else. There's a columnist for the New York Times, Ross Dow, that he wrote something like this a few years ago. If you don't like the Christian right, wait until you meet the post-Christian right. And what that means is if people who think Christians are oppressive, wait until you see a society where Christian influence has been removed. So I think right now the church is in crisis in the United States, actually. The numbers, we always have places where God is working, and that's going to continue. God is always going to be at work. He's always going to be moving. But if you look across the board, the numbers are falling drastically for the millennial and Gen Z generations as far as people who are following Jesus. So I could easily spend half an hour outlining all the reasons why I believe this, why I think there's a dark wave coming, why it's somewhat unescapable. You could say the signs of our times, but I don't have time for that, and I want to spend my time on something else. But I think that what we can expect in the next years throughout the world, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, is an increase in darkness, an increase in chaos, an increase in oppression, violence, hunger, death. These are all going to increase, I think. And along with this, Christians are also going to face increased persecution in many places, especially as the West pulls back from supporting religious freedom around the world, because religious freedom will also be under pressure in the West. It already is, but it will be more in the future. So if you prepare for this, if you prepare for pressure and it doesn't come, you will have lost nothing. But if you don't prepare and then the pressure comes, well, then you could lose everything. So there's a basic principle that I have to say what God says. You know, if God says that Jesus is the only way to salvation, then I have to say that he's the only way. If God says something is good, I have to say it's good. If God says something is sin, then I also have to say it's sin. And when we do this, people are going to react. And I don't know why we're surprised when this happens. Jesus did not say the world is going to love your message. You know, he said, actually, the world hated me and it's going to hate you. And so when we say what he says, there's a reaction. And I think this is because when we walk closely with him, when you're walking closely with Jesus, you carry his aroma. And people react to Jesus in us. So I'm actually here to encourage you, not to tell you about all the darkness. This is why I want to talk about fear. Because I think everyone in this room will be put in situations where the natural reaction will be to fear. And I happen to be a world-class expert on fear. I've been more afraid than probably anyone else in this room. So some time ago, Noreen and I were in a meeting, and someone actually, they had queried ChatGPT to do a study on a Bible study on courage. And this is what ChatGPT said. And of course, ChatGPT is getting its information from all of the sermons and Bible studies and books. So it's a wide query and generally what many Christians would believe. And it defined courage as being fearless and having no fear. And when I heard that, I immediately thought, wait, this is wrong. Because I think many Christians actually have an idealized view and think that Christians should never have the emotion of fear, should always have courage. And I thought that's not really the definition of courage. And I thought of my wife. Now, Noreen I'm not saying anything bad about her when I say she's a fearful person, because she would tell you that herself. She's here in the front row. And I'm thinking when the civil war in Syria heated up, many Syrians came into Turkey because they share a long border. And Noreen and I went out there to try to reach some of those. We thought, here's an opportunity to reach people who have been kind of shut off in the past, have been inaccessible. And so there was danger at the time. There was, if you remember ISIS, they were an Islamist movement and they were killing many people. And when we first went out there, I could hear the bombs exploding. You could hear small arms fire. And we were told, you, especially as Americans, should not be in this area because there's a lot of betrayal, a lot of treachery, and there are a lot of ISIS sympathizers and ISIS people running around here. And so Noreen was apprehensive. She was afraid. And then we would go back to the western part of Turkey, Izmir, the ancient city of Smyrna, one of the churches of Revelation, if you recognize that. And things are a bit quieter there, and she would just breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, I'm back in a safe place. But then a few weeks later, she would go back to that area that had danger. And why did she do that? Well, because she wants to be obedient. She believes God wanted her to do that. And so, see, I call that courage. It's not the absence of fear. It's being obedient in spite of your fear. So we often admire physical courage. We admire the person who runs into a burning building to save someone, or in war, someone who throws himself on a grenade to save his friends. You know, but that kind of heroism, that kind of courage is often very impulsive. It's not thought out. And most of us are going to be faced with a different kind of demand on our courage. You think of a person who knows the possible consequences of obeying God, of saying what God says, for example, and then they steel themselves and they take a stand, and then they remain faithful when the threat actually realizes, and then they continue to stand even when they're paying a price. So this is a different kind of courage. It's deliberate, it's calculated, it's a long-term courage. And it's more difficult in many ways than that impulsive physical courage that we tend to admire. So we need courage. We need to learn to overcome fear, because persecution can be more difficult than we expect. You know, I run into this a lot, and I myself had it. I spoke about this yesterday, so I won't today. But I had an unwarranted sense of confidence, a sense of bravado. Yeah, if I go to prison, it'll be okay. I'll be able to handle it. And actually, many people in the States, many leaders especially, have this, I would say, a naive view of persecution. Kind of like, bring it on. When I talk about the dark wave, yeah, it's going to be good, but because, you know, persecution makes us strong. We can handle it. It makes the church grow, because look at the church in China. I don't know if you've heard about that, but there was very serious persecution. It has come back now intensely. But in spite of that, the church in China grew. It's a very large church now. And so it is true that the church can grow under persecution, except that sometimes it doesn't grow. Sometimes persecution silences the church, because someone can say, look at China. And I say, well, I've lived in the Middle East and worked in the Middle East for 30 years now. And the Middle East used to be majority Christian. And then Islam came and engulfed it. And now there are very few Christians left. And so even when we talk about Chinese, I was speaking with one of the fathers of the Chinese church. And he was arrested a number of times. He was tortured, spent time in prison. And he remained faithful under that pressure, but his wife divorced him so that she could escape that pressure, and she just kind of slid away from her faith. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The son followed in the father's footsteps. The daughter followed the mother. So here you have one family facing the same persecution, but very different results. So persecution brings us to a point of crisis, and it can drive you closer to God, or it can push you away from him. That's why when Jesus talks about persecution, he often includes warnings about the dangers, because it is dangerous. Not everyone makes it through. And in hindsight, I think what would have helped me most in prison, what I was most missing, I wish I had known how difficult it could be. So I don't know that anyone here is going to go to prison for their faith, but even if it's a loss of a job, losing a career, it can sound glorious, you know, suffering for Jesus. And of course it's going to bring great reward. God is you will never regret it in heaven. But that may only come in heaven, the reward. Here in this life, it's possible that you and your loved ones could suffer the consequences of your faithfulness if you remain faithful, and may pay the price for many, many years. And even if the extent is only to be humiliated and despised, hated, that's enough. For many people, it can be very difficult. In fact, when I look at Islam, it's spread with the sword. Turkey used to be majority Christian. Islam came in, and there were many people who died for their faith, who refused to convert, and because of that to Islam, and because of that were killed. But it wasn't really primarily the sword that drove most people to convert. It happened over a period of time, and this happened because of social pressure. Christians were second-class citizens. They didn't have the same rights. They were looked down on. They had to wear certain color clothing, which distinguished them from other people. For example, they weren't allowed to ride horses. They could only ride donkeys. It was a way of humiliating them. And then there was also a high tax that Christians had to pay. Non-Muslims had to pay this tax. Muslims didn't have to pay it. And so over time, the majority of those who moved away from Christianity did not do so because of intense persecution, not because they were imprisoned or killed or had that threat. They did it because of social pressure and financial pressure. And this is what we're going to face in the United States for the most part. It's going to be looked down on, being hated, being marginalized, and because of that, suffering financial consequences. Am I encouraging you yet? Sorry. Anyway, courage does not come naturally always, but it is something we can develop. And people do this in the military. The military prepares a soldier so that he's conditioned to respond the correct way when he's under pressure, even when he's afraid. A friend of mine who ran a training program preparing people for difficulties, he said, we prepare ahead of time so that we're not afraid. And I said, well, speak for yourself. I prepare ahead of time so that when I am afraid, I do not run but stand. Because it's normal to be afraid. In fact, I think it's inescapable. But how do we come to a point where we can overcome fear? How do we build courage? And as I said, I'm a world-class expert on fear. I was separated from my loved ones. I was facing the full, a very hostile government. I had no control over anything. I was locked away. And, President Trump asked for my release at about the 9-month mark of my imprisonment, and there was no movement. And I thought, it can't go any higher than this. I don't know if I'm ever going to get out of prison. And so I was very afraid. I had 3 life sentences hanging over me. So I was in prison for 2 years, but I didn't know that it would be 2 years. I would have been counting the days if that were the case. But as I said, I had those 3 life sentences. So I didn't know if I would get out. And I'm overwhelmed with fear. Fear causes a release of stress hormones. I have adrenaline, cortisol running through me because of this. I can't sleep, maybe 3 hours a day, 4 hours a day max, and this wears my body down over time. I lost about 50 pounds. The stress hormones end up blocking the body's natural tranquilizers, and over time, this means just wave after wave of panic attacks. And so I was overwhelmed with fear, and that fear ended up. It was one of the things that broke me. It broke me physically and mentally and emotionally, and eventually spiritually. So Jesus repeatedly warns his disciples that they're going to encounter persecution and hardship. And he repeatedly exhorts them not to fear. But I think when there's a threat, the natural reaction, I don't know if there's a threat, I cannot avoid the surge of adrenaline or the fast beating heart. That's just natural. We can't avoid it. And actually, fear is one of the emotions that's hardwired into our brain. I think brain science shows us there are several emotions. They're there. You cannot tear them out. And actually, fear has a good purpose. If I didn't have fear, then I would do a lot of reckless things, and I would die young because I wouldn't be afraid of things I should be afraid of. So there's a positive side to it. Fear obviously also has a negative side. But the point is, you can't just tear it out and say, don't be afraid, because the emotion is hardwired in our brain. So I think when Jesus says, do not fear, he's not talking primarily about the emotion of fear. What he's emphasizing is, do not act out of fear. Do not act according to your fear. Don't make decisions out of your fear, because the danger is that the person who surrenders to fear may compromise his faith. They may fall away. They may even deny Jesus. So in my case, it took me about a year to come to the point where I never came to the point where I had no fear. The entire time in prison, I had fear, but I did come to the point where I could stand firm in spite of my fear. It took me about a year to get there. But I would call this overcoming fear. Not the absence of fear, but that I came to the point where I could stand firm in spite of it. And this is what I want to share with you today, how I came to that point. So basically I had to cultivate a different perspective, what I would call a right perspective. And this is how I did it. First of all, I had to cultivate a fear of God, just a straight up fear of God as judge. And there are many things that stood out to me. Eventually, I was allowed to have a Bible in prison, and there's some things that stood out to me in a different way when I was reading them in a Turkish cell. And one was a large number of exhortations to persevere, to overcome, and the consequences of not doing so. And those were hard words for me, especially when I was feeling very weak. But they were very sobering to me. And we rightly emphasize the love of God. That's what we hear a lot about in our churches. But we don't like to talk about judgment and hell very much. And yet Jesus talked about it a good bit. And he did this because there are terrible consequences to denying him, to compromising our faith. And Jesus said it very bluntly. He said it very clearly. He says, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So this was not empty rhetoric. Jesus was warning, and he was also preparing his closest disciples for the difficulties that they were going to face, the hard choices that they would have to make. And in the end, most of them were actually killed for their faith, because when they faced those very difficult choices, they feared God more than they feared man. They remained loyal to Jesus. So there's a healthy fear of God, a fear that God wants us to have, because it encourages loyalty to him. And those were hard verses for me, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling broken, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I can remain faithful. I don't know. I don't know if I can persevere until the end. But they help to build a resolve in me to remain faithful. So at its most basic, the question is whether I will have more fear of man or whether I will have more fear of God. And in our context, Jesus might say, do not fear those who can cancel you in this life. Fear the one who can cancel you in the next. So are you going to be more afraid of the consequences of obeying God? The consequences of obeying God can be persecution. Or are you going to be more afraid of the consequences of not obeying God? And that's standing before him and meeting him as a judge. So I think we need to have the right perspective that although it may be costly to follow Jesus, it can be costly. It will become increasingly costly in the years ahead. It is much more costly not to follow him. So the first thing is developing a fear of God. And the second thing I had to work on was developing eternal eyes, a right perspective on eternity. You know, this is how Paul looked at suffering. He says, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And Paul was right. You know, this life is very short, it's temporary, and then comes forever. And this should put things in perspective. But Paul had an advantage, and I complained a lot about this. Because as you know, Paul had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus that was so powerful that it knocked him to the ground and it changed his life forever. And Paul also talks about actually visiting heaven, that he saw and experienced heaven. So when Paul talks about the perspective of eternity and how really whatever you go through here is worth it because, oh wow, eternity is amazing. He's not saying this in faith. He's saying this, he's speaking out of his experience. So I complained, I begged, I pleaded with God, Jesus, if you would show up in my cell, because I have friends who've been imprisoned for their faith and Jesus showed up in their cell. I think that might make a difference if Jesus looks you in the eyes. And I thought it would make a difference. But he didn't do that for me. And I said, if you would just let me see some of what Paul saw, even for a minute, I'm sure that I would just shut up. I would stop complaining. I would see things differently. But he didn't give me that experience, even though I begged for it. I ran after it. So I had to get it the hard way, the way that most of you will. And so I can tell you from experience that it's possible to develop fear of God, and it's also possible to develop a heavenly perspective, an eternal perspective, even in the most difficult circumstances. And I want to share with you one of the ways that I did this. So near the end of my first year in prison, I was called into a court session, and the judge informed me that there were new charges against me, that I tried to lead a coup and overthrow the government and all kinds of things that were not true. And this carries 3 life sentences in solitary confinement with no possibility of parole. And so I was devastated after this. I couldn't get out of bed for a few days. It was just a very, very heavy thing for me. And a couple of weeks after this happened, I was singing. I was a worship leader for many years, and I was just singing out my grief, my loss. I have 3 children. I want to be with my family, with my wife, and here I have 3 life sentences hanging over me. And just the grief and the loss, I'm singing this out, and what came out of my mouth with that is, you are worthy. You're worthy of whatever tears, whatever pain I go through. And I kept on, and out of this came a heart song, just a cry of my heart to Jesus. And one verse says, I want to be found worthy to stand before you on that day with no regrets, some cowardice, or things left undone. And what happened is that I envisioned standing before Jesus at the end of my life and having him say to me, Andrew, I had assignments for you, but they were left undone because you were a coward. And I had an inheritance I intended you to win in this life, but you didn't because you ran away. And I determined that I did not want to stand before Jesus at the end of my life with regret. Now, this was actually a significant change for me because just a couple of months earlier, I was at a very low point. I was very broken. And I had said to God, I renounce any ministry that you have for me. I do not want to serve you anymore. Now, I'd already been serving him for 24 years. But I said, I don't want any more assignments from you. I'm done. I'm finished. I don't care. I'm not rejecting Jesus, but I don't want to serve you. And I just release me. I'm too weak. I'm too broken. The only thing I want is to be with my family, and I don't care if this disqualifies me from any, rewards. I don't care about that. Just let me go. I don't want to serve you anymore. And this was a terrible failure. I was deeply broken, and it was a terrible failure. Now here I am a couple months later. I'm in a worse situation because now those 3 life sentences have become clear. And now I'm saying the opposite. Now I'm saying, no, I want to complete every assignment you have for me, even if it means remaining in prison. Now, I don't have the strength for this. Give me the strength so I can be faithful, but I want to finish. I want to complete every assignment you have for me and not leave a single one undone, even if it means remaining here, because I'm living for the day that I stand before you. I'm living for the day that I stand before Jesus. And I sang that song every day for the remainder of my imprisonment. And as I repeated it again and again, I'm focused on the day that I'm living, that I'm standing before Jesus. I'm living for eternity. Then this changed from being a declaration of intention to actually becoming the orientation of my life. I think Jordan Peterson said, we become what we repeat. And as I repeated this again and again, it became real in me. This is what I really started to aim for and desire, to live for that day I stand before him. And so a fear of God and a heavenly perspective began to take shape and to grow in me. And it wasn't a feeling. It wasn't just assent to theological truth. There was a spiritual dimension to it. This was supernatural. And this is good news because God really, really wants to build this in us. In fact, he promised to do this. God said to Israel, I will put the fear of me in their hearts so that they do not depart from me. He will put that in us. Holy Spirit is going to help shape our hearts and our minds so that we see and think differently. And the same thing happened in a third area I want to highlight. I discovered heaven in prison. I managed to go through seminary and through, a PhD program, and I never thought about heaven. I never understood it. I grew up in a very boring church and very long meetings, and people afterwards would sometimes say, oh, this is amazing. Heaven's going to be just like this. And I'd say, oh, no. But I discovered heaven in prison, and it's not a boring place. It's going to be amazing. It's not an endless choir rehearsal. And I don't have time to go into detail, but it's going to be absolutely amazing. But one of the things that really began to touch my heart about heaven is that heaven is going to come down to this earth. Heaven is coming down here onto a renewed earth. And so the point is there's going to be continuity with so many things. It's not going to be a strange place to us. There are many things that will be familiar. And relationships will continue with my family, with my friends. And so there's continuity, except that everything is going to be perfect. Now, what Jesus told his disciples that they should invest their treasure, their time, their very lives in heaven. And he told them that they should count the cost, and that whatever the cost, it really, really is worth it. And he focused his disciples on heaven for a reason, because he wanted to take away the fear of death and also excessive attachment to this world. I am attached to this world. That's normal. I'm a human being. This is what I know. It's what's familiar. I'm really attached to my wife, and so that's what drives me, what I'm thinking about. And Jesus wanted to change our attachment, to remove that excessive attachment to this world. And for this to happen, our hearts need to become attached to heaven. We need to retrain our hearts. I was doing an interview with someone named Cindy Jacobs once, and at the end, someone asked some questions for the audience, and we take turns answering them. And the question was, what do you say to someone who's really discouraged, has had just a lot of hardship in life, and they're just really down and out, and they just have no hope? And, I said, well, you persevere. And when it's really hard, you persevere some more. And you just keep going because life is hard, and you persevere. Because that's what I learned in prison. That's what I had to do. And then Cindy said, I would remind them of heaven. And I thought, why didn't I say that? That's true. And I think what's happened is that because we live in the wealthiest country, the wealthiest society in all of history, and because all the advances in technology and medicine, I think that to some degree we've lost the urgency of heaven. We've lost the urgency of the hope, the promise. If you look at many of the hymns or songs that came out of slavery, they've sang so much about heaven because they didn't have a lot of hope here. And I think we've lost that in many ways because we have difficulties in our lives, but we're not in times of continual crisis. So here's how I started to retrain my heart toward heaven. In my second year in prison, that's when God rebuilt my heart. I started a discipline of dancing before the Lord for 5 minutes a day. And I became aware that Jesus commanded us that we're supposed to rejoice when we're persecuted. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil things about you on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they treated the prophets who came before you. That's from Matthew 5. And I realized I had not been rejoicing at all. I was only complaining. And so I decided to perform an act of rejoicing. What could be more joyful than dancing? So I would go out and I'd hop around, you can laugh at me, it's okay. But I'd go and I'd hop around and I'd get and I'd sing those verses for 5 minutes a day. That was a discipline. I didn't feel like doing this. This wasn't my emotions that were driving me. It was a decision of the will to perform an act of rejoicing out of obedience to God. But I'm doing that for 5 minutes a day. I'm hopping around, and when I get to the point where it says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven, I would leap. I say, I rejoice. I'm glad because I'm suffering for Jesus, and because great is my reward in heaven. Well, I can assure you that I didn't care about my reward in heaven. That's not what I'm thinking about. That's not motivating me very much. It's very hard to be difficult to be motivated by a far-off reward when I want immediate relief now. But as I repeated it day after day, I'm rejoicing because great is my reward in heaven. Even though I wasn't feeling any joy and was not really motivated by the idea of reward, something began to change in my inner man. I actually became more focused on heaven. I became desirous of being there. So building the right perspective on eternity. In the same way I had to build the right perspective on suffering that comes from persecution. I was reading a book by a man named Sylvester Krčmárik. He was a medical doctor in Slovakia during the communist period, and many of his friends had been arrested, and he expected that he would be arrested as well because he was one of the leaders of the underground church during the communist period. And the way that he prepared himself for the prospect of prison is that every day he would repeat to himself many times, there is no higher privilege and no greater joy than being invited to suffer for the sake of Jesus Christ. There's no higher privilege, there's no greater joy than being invited to suffer for Jesus Christ. And he says this again and again and again, and then the day comes when the secret police come and they take him away, and he suffered terribly in prison. But as I read his book, I'm comparing his experience to mine, and I'm looking, what are the things that helped him? And it was that preparation ahead of time that set the foundation for him. And it's what underlay his perseverance for years. It was that mindset that he prepared ahead of time. I was talking with a leader, one of the leaders of the previous generation of the Chinese church, and she was telling me that anyone during that time, during that period, who became a leader in the church, they could expect that they would go to prison because that was the experience of most of the leaders. And so they built this into their expectation, and that gave them a different perspective. There were others who had gone before them, others who had suffered, and so it prepared them mentally. It prepared them, their perspective on the possibility of suffering. Now, I didn't have this expectation because no one had been put into their prison for their faith in Turkey in living memory. So I knew I lived with other kinds of risk, but I didn't think about prison. So I had to learn to build a different perspective on suffering in prison. And the way I did that, I learned to suffer in prison. And part of that was I told you about singing those verses from Matthew 5. I rejoice that I'm suffering. I rejoice and I'm glad because I'm being treated the way that people in the past have been treated who suffered for Jesus. I'm also singing my song, "You're worthy of my all. My tears and pain I lift up as an offering. Teach me to share in the fellowship of your suffering. Yes, I will share in your glory if I share your suffering. Jesus, you're worthy of my all." So I'm repeating these things day after day. And also, I was in one prison where it was very cold. It's miserable to be cold if you can't get warm. And there was no way to warm ourselves up in this prison. It's in the mountains. And it was freezing. You could see your breath in the cell. It was cold. And I couldn't change the circumstances that I was in. But I learned that I could change the way I react, the way I respond to my circumstances. And so I decided to turn the misery of being cold into an offering. I say, I don't like being cold, but I choose to embrace this cold. I embrace it. I embrace this discomfort because I choose to suffer for you. And I want to present it to you as an offering of my love for you. Let my suffering be an offering for you. And I was in a different prison where the opposite problem. It was very, very hot. And for months, I had just a rash all over my body from the heat. And I'd rather be hot than cold, just so you know. But it was miserable. And I did the same thing. I said, I hate this heat. I feel so weakened and it's so miserable. But I choose to embrace the discomfort and the suffering from it because I want to present it to you. I want this suffering to have meaning, to have worth. Now, if I had done this ahead of time, if I'd had the right perspective ahead of time, I would have been better prepared. But I did it in prison. I learned it there. And we don't know what kind of persecution we're going to face. It's not healthy to think about all the bad things that could happen to you. But we can prepare with the right mentality. That if we have to suffer, then it's a privilege and it's an honor to suffer for Jesus Christ. And looking back, I haven't talked about my breaking and my weakness, the darkness I was in very much. But there were times, as I look back, when I can recognize a sense of rejoicing, that there was a sweetness in the pain, a closeness of the heart to Jesus, an intimacy that comes from, I know that he knows what I'm feeling. He knows what I'm going through. He knows my heart, and he knows this is for him. And there's a sense of satisfaction that comes because I know I'm suffering for him. There's a sense of privilege that I can suffer, that I can be counted worthy of suffering for the name. A sense that this suffering has value, that it has meaning, it has significance that will last forever. Now, this was not very frequent. It was very subtle. It's kind of like grace. Where is it? I can just barely see it. And it did not cancel out the pain. It was in the midst of pain, but it was there sometimes. So all of these things, cultivating fear of God, of eternal eyes, eternal perspective, of looking to heaven, of learning to suffer. My perspective had changed over the months and it built something in me. So when I was finally put on trial, I declared before the judges, before the prosecutors, before the Turkish media, this is what I was able to say. And I'm reading from the actual court transcripts. I said, "Blessed am I, because for the sake of Jesus, many people have wronged me, have persecuted me, and I'm now suffering. Blessed am I, because I've been forcibly separated from my wife and children. Blessed am I, because I am in prison, and I choose willingly to suffer for the sake of Jesus. And by suffering for his sake, I hope to display for everyone his incomparable worth." Now, that felt like a victory to me. And thinking this way did not make things easy. They sent me right back to prison after I said that. Suffering was still painful. I still felt grief. I felt intense loneliness. I felt the loss of my family. And I still had feelings of fear. But countering this was a conviction, an insistent voice inside me saying, you cannot run. There are great and important things at stake. Stand firm. My mother was allowed to visit me early on in my detention, and I'm sitting across from her. I'm already breaking. I was already breaking down in many ways, going into crisis. And I'm sitting across from my mom, and I'm crying. I'm saying, "Look, Mom, look what's happened to me. Look what they've done to me. How broken I am." And just to let you know what my mother's like, she said, "Well, of course you're crying. This is suffering. They wouldn't call it suffering if it was easy." I'm saying, "Mom, I need some compassion here." But she said to me, "Andrew, there's a long line of people who've suffered for Jesus Christ. It's a line that extends 2,000 years. And my son, it's now your turn to stand in that line." And I didn't want to hear that. That was a difficult thing to hear. It's a hard truth. But as my imprisonment extended, I began to think of those who had gone before me. I had tore out a picture of Richard Wurmbrandt, another Brother Yun, a Chinese man, people who'd suffered in prison for their faith, and I had it next to my bed, and I'd look at it multiple times a day, and I thought of people who'd gone before me, suffered before I had, and they were an inspiration to me because they left an example of faithfulness under pressure, faithful endurance. And I thought, if they did it, then I should be able to do it as well. I don't know that I can, but I should be able to. So I'm thinking of those who've gone before me, and at some point I became aware, yes, there are people who've gone before me, but there's going to be a line that will come after me. And I need to leave them an example of faithful endurance. And some of you, my brothers and sisters, some of you may have to stand in that line. And if you do, you will be on display. You'll be on display for other believers because courage is contagious. When people see your courage, they're more likely to stand. But you'll also be on display for unbelievers, like I was in the Turkish court. Because when you're willing to suffer for the sake of Jesus Christ, this is a very powerful, the most powerful witness there is for the gospel. So I say to you, prepare to be on display. Prepare to suffer. And start working on this eternal perspective now. Ask God to put the fear of him in your heart so you will not depart from him, so that you won't give in to the fear of man. And I started to do this early on. I pursued it. I begged God for it because I knew that I really needed it. And declare what is true. My citizenship is in heaven. I'm living for the day I stand before Jesus. Jesus is my reward. It's an honor and privilege to suffer for Jesus. And declare it repeatedly, and you'll begin to believe it, and you'll begin to live according to that belief. Work on developing eternal eyes so that you have the right perspective, and count the cost. Determine that you're willing to pay the price. You know, Jesus tells his disciples in Luke 21, he warns his disciples there's going to be violence, wars, pestilence, famine, fearful events. And then he goes on to tell them in detail the kind of persecution they'll face. He says they will seize you, persecute you, even family and friends will betray you. Some will be killed. Everyone will hate you because of me. Jesus, don't encourage us so much. That's not very encouraging, is it? He says, but not a hair of your head will be harmed. Now we have to redefine what harm means because that sounds very harmful to me. But he says, stand firm and you will win life. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads because your redemption is drawing near. Now, as we enter, what he's saying is as we enter darkness, as we enter more difficult times, as we come under pressure, stand firm and lift your head in hope and expectation. And the only way that you can do that is if you have a different perspective. If you have the right perspective. And Noreen told me, she said to me when I was in prison, if we go through this the right way, in the end, we will have no regrets. Now, when she told me this, I'm in prison. She does not know if I'll get out or not. And what she was saying to me, she doesn't know what the result will be here in this life. But what she was saying to me is, go through this the right way. Keep your heart tender toward God. Continue to love him. Remain faithful. And you'll have no regrets in eternity. I want to finish with earlier this year, I listened to an interview, a man named Roland Fryer with Barry Weiss. And he's a professor of economics at Harvard, a real star. Went there when he was very young, was rising very rapidly. And he's African American, and he was doing some research about police brutality. And the results of his research were going against the narrative of the culture. And he was very surprised by this. He expected different results. So the next year, he did the same research again with a new group of research assistants. And he ended up getting the same results. And he was surprised by this. But he decided to publish his results. And people around him warned him, don't publish this. This isn't going to go well for you because it's really challenging the majority narrative about this subject. And people are not going to like this. There will be a reaction. But he went ahead and published it anyway. And there was a reaction. He was no longer invited into his social circles in the same way. People targeted him at Harvard, and he was demoted, and he was actually suspended for a time. And Barry Weiss asked him, says, what drove you to do this? He said, I do not covet what they covet. And that really stuck with me. I do not covet what they covet. He said, you see, when you go to Harvard, you've worked really hard to get there. Now you have entry into the elite status. And so people do not want to do anything that would threaten that status. And so they all move like a herd. You don't question anything. You don't want to take any risks because you don't want to put your future at risk, your status at risk. Because this is the most important thing, is to have people approve of you and accept you into those circles. So the faculty don't rock the boat. The students are encouraged not to. You don't want to lose your place in elite society. And so this is what drives them. This is how they make their decisions. This is why they all have groupthink. And Roland Fryer said, I do not covet what they covet. Because he wants truth. And this really stuck with me. Don't covet what they covet. Don't fear what they fear. Don't run after what they run after. Don't love what they love. Set your heart on the approval of Jesus, on the approval of our Heavenly Father. Run after his approval. Don't covet what they covet. And you'll be tempted to that, as you're going into law, the circles you run in. There'll be pressure to conform. If you want to rise to elite status, especially, don't covet what they covet. Set your eyes on eternity, what really matters, when you stand before Jesus at the end of your life. Don't stand there with regret. I'm wanting to live in light of the next 1,000,000 years. The next 10 million years. That's what I want to live in light of, and make my decisions according to that. A friend of mine said, when and how you die is not important. We're all going to die. What matters is how you live. So live for him. Father God, Holy Spirit, come and open our eyes so that we can see what we don't see now. Open our eyes so that we have the perspective of heaven and can live with confidence. In Jesus' name, I bless you all in the name of my King. Amen.